Okay, looks like we are live. Hopefully you can hear me. Let me just test to see. Can you hear me? Hmm, Make sure the mic is working. Make sure it's not coming from here. I don't know. Hopefully this is working. I jumped on a minute early here just to make sure everything was functioning, but it's hard for me to tell with the mic till we get some folks on here. So in any case, I'm going to get started and hopefully this works because if it doesn't, I'll just have to do it again. In any case, hi, I'm Evie. Thank you so much for joining me on today's live. I want to apologize up front. This will have to be a little bit shorter than I originally intended. I may be able to pull off about 15 to 20 minutes today because I forgot that I have an appointment that I have to leave for right at 5:20. So, I'm going to try to do what I can to cover as much material as possible, but I appreciate you for your patience with me and definitely look forward to any comments that you might have or anything you might put into the chat, all that. So, let me start off by saying that my goal for today's live, well, let me actually start off by saying I have some notes here. So if you see me looking down, that's why. I'm looking at my notes to make sure I stay on track and stay within my my parameters time-wise today. But my goal for today's live is to really help you with preserving your sourdough starter, to protect your investment of time, resources, patience into building that starter so that you can continue to bake sourdough bread and other sourdough related baked goods. All right. And so the way I want to help you with that today is to focus on methods for preserving your starter, specifically the method of dehydration. And while this may seem really simple and really straightforward, I did want to take some time today to explain to you a few things. Number one, why would it matter? Why would you bother to dehydrate any of your sourdough starter? Number two, a few of the methods that you can use to dehydrate your starter, as well as the pros and cons of each of those methods. And then third, I wanted to just take some time to review a resource or a couple of resources that I have available to you if you haven't already accessed them, which may help you if you haven't actually started your sourdough journey or if you've actually started and have been frustrated in the past with creating your own starter. I have a few resources that can help you out there. Okay, so those are my three main goals I want to cover in today's live. And so I'm going to jump right in. First of all, by explaining why you might want to dehydrate your starter at all to begin with, right? So, one of those reasons may be because you travel, you go on vacation, and frankly, you don't want to come back from your vacation of a week, 2 weeks, a month, however long, and find that your starter that you left in your fridge has gotten moldy or you know, has become has reached a condition where you feel like either you might have to throw it away or it may take multiple days to bring it back to life. Dehydration is just a really great way of managing your starter without having to manage your starter. um, Number two, kind of related to what I just said, it's great backup. It's a great backup protection so that if you have an active starter that you are maintaining actively, and then something happens where that active starter gets contaminated, or perhaps you miscalculate and you end up using all of that active starter in a recipe and then realize after the fact that you have none left, having some dehydrated starter as a backup is a really great option. A third reason that you may want to dehydrate some starter is because, especially once your starter becomes really robust, you may want to start sharing it with other people. Because I know that for me, at least, once I started making sourdough, I got excited about sourdough and telling people about sourdough, sharing information about sourdough with people. And so, having some of your own dehydrated starter available that you can then share with family, friends, colleagues, acquaintances, or even if you start your own sourdough business and you want to sell it, and you can sell it legally through the laws in your state or in your area, then this is another great reason to dehydrate some of your starter. And then what I would say is the fourth reason is that when you compare dehydrated starter to storing it in the refrigerator or even in your freezer, this is just a much more, I would say, a more robust method for long term preparedness. So, if you store your starter in the fridge, I typically advise people to not leave it in the fridge for more than a week before feeding it again. Sure, you can go longer. That's fine. You can bring it back to life after a month of being neglected. It's totally true. It's totally possible. And you could even store some of your starter in the freezer and have it sit in there and be perfectly okay for months at a time. But then what happens when the electricity goes out and you don't have that cushion of preserving that living starter through, those cooler temperatures when the yeast is kind of, pretty much dormant? Dehydrated starter is just a really great way to store your starter for long-term use. And I'll talk a little bit later about how long you can store it dehydrated. But I just want you to know that to me, that's actually one of the best reasons to have it as a backup. And that's not to say you couldn't use these other methods. I honestly use really all three. I have a backup starter in my fridge. I have some in my freezer, and I have dehydrated starter as well. So I'm the kind of person who likes to have a backup to the backup to the backup. And that's just how I like to operate in life. But again, we'll talk a little bit more now about how you can go about actually dehydrating your starter. So the first step is to, of course, have a lot of your excess active starter ready for dehydration. And the way that you can do that is you can take something as little as like 10 grams of your starter. You can add 100 grams of filtered water to it, 100 grams of flour, mix it all together, and let it bubble up and become active. Once it reaches its peak activation, like it has doubled in size, usually within a 4 to 6 hour time frame. Well, actually, let me back that up. I just realized I skipped over a very key important point here. When I described that 10 grams of starter with 100 grams each of water and flour, I was describing a 1 to 10 to 10 ratio of starter to water and flour. When you feed your starter with a high ratio of filtered water and flour, it will take a little bit longer for your starter to reach its peak active state. And so it wouldn't necessarily be a 4 to 6 hour time frame. It could be more along the lines of 8 to 12 hours. Again, depending on a lot of different factors, such as the temperature of the area in which you are, where you leave your starter, and also the humidity levels in that area, perhaps in your kitchen on the counter. And so, with all those factors in mind, I would recommend, if you are going to feed your starter at that higher ratio, just expect it to take a little bit longer than 4 to 6 hours for it to reach peak activation. Now, when I say peak activation, that's indicated by a number of things. One, you will see bubbles throughout the starter. You'll see it on the top, you'll see it along the sides. If you're using a glass container, it's very easy to see it in a clear glass container that you have bubbles all along the sides and even along the bottom. You will notice that if you were to smell your starter, it smells like a fresh yeasty smell. You can actively see bubbles forming and popping too when it's really active. And another big indicator, of course, is that the amount of starter that you see in that container will appear to have doubled in size. And that's specifically based on, or I should say, due to the carbon dioxide that's given off by the yeast as it continues to eat through the flour that you've fed it in that process. Now, once you've reached that point where it's at its peak, that is the ideal time for you to prepare that starter for dehydration. Now, at this point, I want to talk about a few different methods that you can use to dehydrate your starter. Okay. Now, I'll describe each method very briefly, as well as a few pros and cons that go with each one. And based on that information, I hope that informs you enough to determine which method or methods may be best for your situation. Okay. So the first method is to use just room temperature air drying. When you do that, I would say one of the easiest methods to do that is to take a large piece of parchment paper and put it on, I would say put it on a cookie sheet or something. Actually, not really a cookie sheet, like a cooling rack, because you want there to be some airflow. Put it on top of that, and then take your active starter, pour it onto the parchment paper, and just spread it along with a spatula. Okay. Spread it as thinly as possible, because the thinner that starter is on the parchment paper, the faster it will dry out. Okay. And this is something that can take anywhere from 24 to 48 hours. Again, a lot of factors such as your humidity levels, the temperature and the environment, those are all factors that will determine how long it takes. But when we think about the pros of this particular method, it's really simple. It's very inexpensive because you don't have to use any sort of electrical cost associated with it. You need very little in the way of tools or equipment. So you're not using like an electronic device to do it. And then it's also pretty low effort, you know? You just like after you've already fed it, it's already active. At that point, you just kind of dump it out and spread it out and you're done. Now, here are the cons. It can be very challenging to avoid contamination because sourdough starter is it's really a magnet, it seems, for fruit flies. I don't care where you live. If there are any fruit flies within like 100-mile radius, I promise you it will find your sourdough starter. Okay. So that's a con. Another con is that it can take up some counter space or space on a table wherever you decide to place it in your kitchen, your dining room, wherever. So it can take up a good bit of space for that 24 to 48-hour period. You want to be aware of that, because again, you also don't want, if you have any animals, if you have young children, you don't want them to, again, related to the contamination issue, to put their hands in or on or around it. And then the other con, if you want to think of it this way, is that it does take the longest of the three methods I'm describing today. So again, it'll take anywhere from 24 to 48 hours. It could even take longer. But these are just things to keep in mind when you're considering how you want to dehydrate your starter. Method number two is to basically essentially do method number one, but instead of like leaving it out on your counter, you could take that tray or of parchment paper and you just place it in your oven and you turn on either the oven light, or if you have a dehydrator setting in your oven, you go ahead and use that, because there are plenty of ovens out there these days that have a dehydrator setting. I would just recommend that you ensure that the temperature in your oven does not exceed 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Otherwise, you risk killing off your yeast, the bacteria, like it just kills your starter and you pretty much have to start over. Okay. So that's another method that you could use, very similar to the room temperature method. But again, some of the pros include that it is simple. It does require minimal electrical cost because you would be using like the oven light or the dehydrator setting, but it's protected from contamination, which is a really good thing. And then at the same time, it's also pretty low effort. Additionally, it can take a little bit less time. It could take closer to like more towards the 24-hour time frame versus 48 or longer hours. Now, some of the cons include this really isn't an option, obviously, if you don't have an oven light or if you don't have a dehydrator setting on your oven. My oven, it has an oven light, but the bulb is out. So I can't use that. And it does not have a dehydrator setting. So this wasn't really an option for me. One other thing is that your oven will be off limits for several hours. Now, one thing I would recommend, strongly recommend, is that you use something like this. Have a sign that basically reminds yourself and tells anybody else in your household that the oven is off limits for however long it needs to be off limits until your sourdough starter is dehydrated. And then another thing is that I would recommend that you monitor the internal temperature of your oven just to make sure it doesn't exceed that 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Um, and truthfully, again, it's another thing where I would call this a con, which is that it actually could take almost as long as it would take if you were to dehydrate at room temperature. I think it would be a little bit shorter, but just not by a whole lot. Okay. So this is just something else to keep in mind. You might want to, also grab an oven thermometer or something so that you can just again monitor the temperature in the oven and make sure that it just doesn't exceed the 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, the third method that I want to talk about today is having a dedicated dehydrator. This is by far, you know, the fastest approach for sure. That's a definite con. I mean, sorry, a definite pro is that this can be done potentially within 8 to 12 hours, depending on how much of it you have and, how thinly you lay it out on the parchment, etc. Um, you can also position your dehydrator to be out of the way, so it's not taking up nearly as much counter space or table space. You can dehydrate usually larger volumes of starter because most dehydrators have, well, not most, I shouldn't say that. Some dehydrators come with multiple racks or shelves. So if you have like 4, 5, or 6 shelves, you could certainly dehydrate a lot more in a smaller footprint compared to using just a really, really long piece of parchment paper. And then it's also really great because you have that consistency with the controlled temperature and even the airflow within the dehydrator. Now, some obvious cons include higher cost upfront to actually purchase a dehydrator if you don't already have one. And not to say that you have to buy the most expensive, you really don't. But if you're looking to use this on a regular basis for this or other things, you may want to invest a little bit more. Secondly, there will be ongoing electricity costs associated with it because you would need to run this device for, again, anywhere from 8 to 12 hours. And then obviously there's cleanup required for every method, but in this case, it could be a little bit more intense because you're dealing with the actual dehydrator itself potentially needing to be cleaned in addition to whatever you put your starter on, whether it's like parchment paper or some kind of silicone mat or something along those lines. So, if you already have a dehydrator, this may be a good choice for you. But I just wanted to let you know that, in terms of overall major methods for dehydrating your starter, I would say these are kind of like the top three. Now, I'm going to throw in here the very first method that I used, which I have not described yet, but you may find that it works well for you to do as well. And it's gonna sound so silly because it's so simple, but it's true. All right. When I first started preparing sourdough, when I would feed my starter, and you've probably noticed in a lot of videos, I use these silicone spatulas, usually this shape or like a more rectangular shaped one. You can see here, and I purposefully left some of the starter here so that you could see it. There is starter that's dried onto this spatula. Watch this. Okay. It's dry. And it very easily just flakes off well, you can't see it flaking off because it's flaking down, but it very easily flakes off of this spatula. And for a little while, when I would see this, I knew I was not supposed to put sourdough starter down my sink, but I kept kind of wiping this off and then realizing, wait a second, I probably should keep this in a jar because I bet you I could rehydrate this in the future if I wanted to. And that is exactly what I did. Anytime that I had some excess starter that I had on a spatula or maybe even was left in a plastic bowl because I fed too much into a bowl and then used whatever I needed, but then I still had like a kind of a layer in the bowl of just starter. I would let it air dry. And once it was completely air dry, I would crumble it up and I would put it in a pint-sized jar like this one. Now, this is Gloria. This is some dehydrated Gloria. That's the name of my starter, my main starter. I have two now. I have Gloria and I have Phoenix. Okay, Phoenix I just created about a month ago. Gloria has been with me since February of 2024. And I created this dehydrated starter from Gloria using about I think I want to say I used a little over 200 grams of active Gloria to make this 1 pint size jar. And when I did it, I used parchment paper. And you can see here that it created, when I crumbled it up, these flakes. They're kind of thick. They're thicker than I would have liked. But the good thing is, once you have your dehydrated starter, and if you're using a parchment paper or whatever you're using, you just want to crumble it up as small as you can. It doesn't have to be like super tiny. You can, this size is perfectly fine, which I would say these are, I don't know, if you want to compare it to the size of my finger, um, it like, or the nail, it covers my nail. So like that size, whatever that is, maybe a centimeter by a centimeter. um, and, but yeah, once you have it, you can very easily just put it in, like kind of wrap it in the parchment paper, put that inside of like a freezer bag or just a plastic bag, and then take a mallet or like a tenderizer, like a meat tenderizer, and just crush it, like literally crush it into smaller pieces. Or if you want to be a little fancy, you can use something like this, mortar and pestle, and just like grind it up in there. I don't know if you can see, I have a little bit. Let me see if it'll show on camera. Yeah, I think you can barely see it, but you can grind it up in that if you want. And then that way it'll just be even smaller and easier to store. And speaking of storage, I would recommend, if you can, use something like like a small mason jar. Even better if you happen to find one of those mason jars that is like a dark color, like a dark brown colored mason jar, and then have a really nice tight closed lid on it. That's actually really good too, because there are a couple of things that you want to make sure you do when you are preserving your dehydrated starter. You want to make sure that it's not exposed to moisture, which is why you want it to be an airtight container. You also want to make sure that you have very little exposure to sunlight. Definitely no direct sunlight exposure, because again, that can heat it up, and you don't want this to get heated up. It's best to keep it in a cool, dark place, basically, is what I'm trying to say. Okay. Now, one thing I just realized I skipped over as I'm looking down at my notes here is that there are two key things I want to point out to you, and I actually need to run now. Actually, I have 2 minutes left. Okay. So there are two key things I want to make sure to leave you with before I forget. One is, when you are dehydrating your starter, especially if you're using like the oven method or you're using a dedicated dehydrator, you want to make sure that you do not exceed 95 degrees Fahrenheit. The other thing is, and I've mentioned it before as well, you want to avoid contamination. So do the best you can to avoid contamination. One suggestion I would have, especially if you're using the first method I mentioned, where you're leaving it on a parchment paper out on your counter or on your table in your kitchen, you have concerns about fruit flies. If you have a breathable cloth, like a large breathable cloth that you can drape over it, but then have like a toothpick or something else to kind of build almost like a tent over your whatever you set your parchment paper on, that can really help you out as far as keeping any and all pests away from it. Another thing that you can do as well is, if, like me, you don't have an oven light that's working, and you also don't have a dehydrator setting on your current oven, you can actually put that, like a cookie sheet or whatever you have the parchment paper on with your starter, you can stick that in your oven and just leave it in there. Just leave the door closed. Again, I'm going to emphasize the importance of having a sign. It doesn't have to be this sign, but have a sign to let people know that they should not turn on the oven at all during the time period in which you're letting it dehydrate. Okay. So those are the two key things I wanted to make sure to share with you. I guess another thing I want to also share is, you want to make sure to also label your container that you're putting it in. I have not labeled this yet. I will label it though, especially now that I have two different starters, so that I know that this is Gloria. I'm actually going to be grinding these up into smaller pieces because I am starting to sell my dehydrated starter. I will be sharing a link to that uh, to where you can purchase this in a future video. I don't have it ready yet. I mean, it's ready, but it's not. I'm not ready to start yet. But I will be sharing that with you in the future, so that if you are interested in ordering some of your own Gloria dehydrated, you're more than welcome to order that from me. Um, I'd be more than happy for you to order that. And another thing I wanted to also emphasize is that if you are new to sourdough starter, anything related to this journey of dealing with sourdough and sourdough bread, I'd be more than happy to let you know. I am more than happy to let you know that I have a really great bundle available for you. For just $3, you can get a 7-day starter success checklist, a complete troubleshooting guide that goes through kind of all the ins and outs of what you could expect if something were to go wrong, how you could remedy it, or what the next step should be. And then I also have 3 really, really good discard muffin recipes that come with this bundle. The bundle's only $3. So really and truly, even if you don't end up using it, I promise you, you probably know someone who could use it. So think of that as maybe that's even a potential gift that you give someone who is really interested and passionate about sourdough but doesn't know where to start. This would be a great gift for them. You can find it at www.risenourishconnect.com/sourdough starter bundle. And you can definitely find your way to creating a healthy, robust starter by following the guidelines that I provide there. I also have a video series about starting your own starter and a number of other things related to sourdough. You're more than welcome to follow those as well. And so, yeah, I think that kind of covers everything I had in mind to cover today. I'm running late now. Oh my goodness, I'm 1 minute. Okay. I'm going to give myself one more minute to just say one last thing here, which I had in my notes too. If you're at all interested in learning about rehydrating a dehydrated starter, if you're interested in learning more about different what they call sourdough discard recipes, or recipes that where you can use extra sourdough starter that you have, whether it's active starter or inactive starter, or if you just have other questions about sourdough starter or sourdough bread or sourdough baking in general, please feel free to leave those in the comments. Let me know. You can also follow me on Instagram. You can find me there at Evie's Artisan Bakery. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have there. I am welcoming any and all ideas you guys have, because I would love to hear your input as I continue to create content for you. Okay? So please feel free to do that. And I look forward to hearing more from you. Thank you again so much for watching this live or watching the replay. And yeah, thanks again for all of your support. And just remember to rise, nourish, and connect. Have a great day, everyone. Bye.